Luke chapter 23. Luke chapter 23. If you're using one of the Pew Bibles, it's on page 638. Luke 23, and if you'll follow along with me, I'm going to read verses 1 down through 25. And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. So, remember, this whole multitude of them, that is the Sanhedrin that we discussed at the end of last week's message, and they lead Jesus unto Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And Pilate asked him, saying, Art thou the king of the Jews? And he answered him and said, Thou sayest it. Then said Pilate to the chief priest and to the people, I find no fault in this man. And they were the more fierce, saying, He stirreth up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, in other words, throughout all the Jewish land, beginning from Galilee to this place. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of Jesus, and he had hoped to have some miracle done by him. Then he questioned with him in many words, but he, Jesus, answered him nothing. And the chief priest and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod, with his men of war, set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. The same day, Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. And Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people, said unto them, Ye have brought this man unto me as one that perverteth the people, and behold, I, having examined him before you, have found no fault in this man touching those things whereof ye accuse him. No, nor yet Herod, for I sent you to him, and lo, nothing worthy of death is done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him, for of necessity he must release one unto them at the feast. In their response to this chastisement and release, they cried out all at once, saying, Away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas, who for a certain sedition made in the city, and for murder was cast into prison. Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus, spake again to them, but they cried out, saying, Crucify him! Crucify him! And he said unto them the third time, Why? What evil hath he done? I have found no cause of death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. And they were instant with loud voices, requiring that he might be crucified. And the voices of them and of the chief priest prevailed. And Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they required. And he released unto them him that for sedition and murder was cast into prison, whom they had desired, but he delivered Jesus to their will. What a passage of Scripture before us this morning. Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? I remember growing up, I was about 8 or 9. We lived on James Street in Syracuse. And it was a Sunday morning. A certain evil sibling of mine, and I say certain evil sibling because I don't know which sibling it was, but they did something, and they have not yet fessed up to it, and hopefully one of these days they'll be convicted about it and they'll confess that I was the one that did this. But what they did is they took a box of Raisin Bran. Now, this is my personal favorite cereal. And as a warning, this might be triggering for some of you, depending on your sensibilities, but they opened the box, and instead of opening the bag with some semblance of order and some rationality, see if I can do it again. There we go. So instead of opening it nice and neatly or whatever, they took the bag and they just opened the bag up and poured themselves some cereal, and it went everywhere as it did here, and it's already down the box and everything. That's what they did. And then you want to know what happened. My dad went into the kitchen to get himself some cereal, and he found a box of Raisin Bran that he tried to pour the cereal out of, but it just went everywhere because they had opened the bag incorrectly, or as they should have. It's probably one of the most annoying things that could have been done to a box of cereal. Now, I don't know if it was the offender or if it was potentially another evil sibling of mine, but somebody accused me of having ripped open the bag of cereal. My dad called me down from my room upstairs and asked why I had ripped open the box of cereal, and I explained it wasn't me and I had not been in the kitchen yet that morning for breakfast. Yet for whatever reason, my dad persisted and believed strongly that I had done so, such that I received numerous spankings that Sunday morning for refusing to fess up to having ripped open the bag of cereal. Now, thankfully it was a Sunday morning, so we had to go to church at some point in time, so we couldn't rehash the thing all day long, and so it ended at some point in time and we went to church. Well, to this day, I maintain my innocence, and again, I hope someday someone will confess and be convicted enough to announce, or maybe they'll do it at my funeral. They'll get up and be like, all right, I admit it, I was the one that did it, or something like that. I don't know. But somebody will announce that they ripped open the bag of Raisin Bran.
You probably forgot by now.
They may have forgotten. I have not forgotten. It is imprinted on my brain from 25-something years ago. Now,
how do you still remember?
Because it was that traumatic, apparently. Obviously, there is no true comparison between the Raisin Bran bag ripper and the story before us in Luke 23. But it does get us into the story about being accused, about things he'd never done without fault. Jesus has been arrested. He faced trial by Annas, by Caiaphas, and then by the Sanhedrin that we looked at the end of last week's message. And now the Sanhedrin have dragged Jesus before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of the Judean region, so basically right around Jerusalem area. And they have basically accused Jesus of being the most anti-Roman person that ever lived. And thus we see the initial indictment against Jesus is threefold. Now, of these three, the first and third accusations against Jesus are, I say that they are an extreme twisting of the truth. They're not lies per se. You could say they're a lie, but at best, they're just an extreme twisting of the truth. Now, the middle one, however, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, that's an outright lie. There's no way you can get around that one. It's an outright lie. But it is interesting, I found, how they talk about Jesus in verse 2. What do they say? They say, we found this fellow. We found this person is the literal rendering of that. As though they had been fully unaware of Jesus, they'd never heard of him, and they stumbled upon Jesus in the middle of the Roman streets in Jerusalem, and suddenly they found, oh, Jesus is just trying to, pervert the nation. He's forbidding taxes to Caesar. He's saying he's Christ a king. And they didn't even know his name. They just happened upon him. And so now they're bringing him before Pilate as a good citizen would do, so Pilate could judge him for this man's actions. Now, the three indictments they bring against Jesus are intentional, because these three would have captured the attention of the Roman government. The Roman government, unsurprisingly, and Caesar, unsurprisingly, would not have taken kindly to a person doing these things. A simple accusation of these things could lead to severe beating and whipping, to even death if you were found guilty of them. Now, we could fall prey to their trickery, or Pilate could fall prey to their trickery, but we have to be aware of something about Pilate. He was almost certainly aware of this scheming that they were doing. You might say it takes one to know one, but what we have recorded of Pilate is he's a very cunning, a very vicious, and a very vile man. And while he would have been aware of these instances of happening, he would have understood that while there could be a little bit of truth to these things, Jewish people did not bring Jewish people to the Romans to be judged. The Jewish people didn't want the Romans there, obviously. We thoroughly understand that. They didn't want to be subject to the Romans, and therefore no Jewish person would bring a Jewish person to the Romans to be judged. Unless, of course, and this is what Pilate would have known, the real reason was because that person had, broken one of their laws or offended them in some way. And then the Jewish people, because then they couldn't enforce capital punishment on someone, they would bring him to the Romans and give the Roman charges. That way the Romans would do the dirty work for them, if you will. It was really a way that the Jewish people could attempt to absolve themselves of guilt in the matter. So they bring 3 accusations. Perverting the nation. In other words, it's an attempt at the insurrection or leading an insurrection against Rome, overthrowing the government. And the reason I say that this is a twisting of the truth is, and not really an outright lie, it's because in a way, Jesus was leading an insurrection against the Roman government. Now, not in the way that they meant it. They meant it in a physical form. Jesus was literally trying to overthrow the Roman government. Jesus wasn't trying to do that. However, he was leading an insurrection. An insurrection against sin, against the powers of the enemy, the adversary, the devil. And we understand that the devil would have been the one that's working behind the scenes in Caesar's and Herod's and Pilate's life to position them and move them along the flow. So, was Jesus leading an insurrection against Rome? Not really, as they thought, and as they claimed to Pilate, but yes, in a way, he was. Now, the outright lie, of course, he forbid taxes to Caesar. You remember the story. They tell him taxes are due. Jesus says, go fishing. In the fish's mouth, you'll find the coin. That coin will be sufficient to pay the taxes. Take that coin, go pay the taxes to Caesar. What did they find? Exactly as Jesus said. And then back in chapter 20, we just looked at it a couple weeks back. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? What does Jesus say? Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Render to God that which is God. That is no forbidding of taxes. So, outright lie. Now, the third accusation is the one that Pilate hones in on, and the one that has the most truth of any of them in regard to their reasoning for bringing Jesus. But again, I say this is an extreme twisting of the truth. Because they say what? Jesus is claiming to be the Christ. Now, that's the Greek word, remember, for the Hebrew word Messiah. And the definition I gave you of Christ or Messiah is this. It is the anointed one sent to fulfill that which is promised in the Hebrew scriptures. That is the Christ. That is the Messiah. That was what that person would do. They are the anointed one. Now, that claim is true. Jesus did present himself to be the Christ. And even when asked whether or not he was the Christ, he did not reject that title upon himself. However, they twisted it just a little bit. Because king is not really the meaning of Christ. In a way, yes, but not really. Was Jesus Christ? Yes. Would Jesus be a king? Was Jesus already a king? Yes. He's the king of all kings, as we read this morning. But being a king is not truly the meaning of Christ. And so they present it to Pilate as though he's claiming to be the Christ, meaning he's a king. That's what that word means. Not really. So I'm being maybe a little generous to the Sanhedrin here in saying it's just an extreme twisting of the truth and not an outright lie. However, Pilate does hone in on that word, king. And he asks, what? Art thou the king of the Jews? And what does Jesus say? It is as you say. In the affirmative, yes, I am the king of the Jews. Now, Luke doesn't record it for us because it almost Luke makes it seem like Jesus says, yes, I'm the king of the Jews, and Pilate's like, all right, you're good, no problem. That's not the full part of the story, as is recorded elsewhere. Jesus goes on to answer and say, yes, I am a king, but my kingdom's not of this world. It's a spiritual kingdom. And I'm guessing, based on what Pilate comes to indicate by that conversation, is Pilate basically comes to the conclusion, oh, you're a king. Yeah, you're a king of a spiritual kingdom, of a kingdom not of this world. Oh, okay, so he basically finds Jesus innocent, more or less on the aspect of, he might be a little bit, maybe a little kooky in the head or something like that. Jesus, yeah, he's innocent, but he's innocent because he's not truly doing what they say. He determines Jesus is clearly no threat to the Romans. But what do? They persist. They were more fierce. And they go on telling him about how he stirs up all the people. And he's been doing this ever since Galilee, and now he's here in Jerusalem. And Herod says, wait a second. Or Pilate says, wait a second. Galilee? Oh, he's from Galilee? Oh, well, I can solve this problem real easy. He needs to go to Herod. Not my jurisdiction. I remember saying that when I worked in 911 dispatch all the time. Not my jurisdiction. Oklahoma City police were the worst about trying to give us their accidents that were in their jurisdiction. And we always, nope, not our jurisdiction, not our problem. You got to go deal with that accident. Sorry. Anyway, Herod Antipas is the Herod spoken of here, son of Herod the Great. And he was the Jewish leader, and that's an important distinction to note, because we often don't necessarily think of it right off the top of our head, but Herod was a Jewish man. He was a Jew. And he's in Jerusalem at Passover, likely because of the Passover festivities. But Herod was no saint, that is for sure. Unless we see, number 2, the trivial treatment of Jesus. And Luke doesn't tell us what accusations they made against Jesus to Herod. Rather, Luke makes more clear to us the intensity by which they made those accusations. The fact that Pilate had deferred his judgment to Herod likely signaled to the Sanhedrin and these Jewish leaders that he's slipping away. Jesus is slipping away. We're not going to be able to kill him like we want. We're not going to be able to get rid of him like we want. And so they realize it's slipping away, and so they determine we must be more passionate, we must be more aggressive, we must be much louder and fiercer and vehement against Jesus. That way, Herod does something. Now, Herod's encounter with Jesus is different than Pilate's. Because with Pilate, Jesus answered. But when Herod talks to Jesus, Jesus says nothing. Nothing at all. Not one word to Herod. Why? We find in verse 8 that when he gets to Herod, Herod was glad, exceedingly glad. He desirous to see Jesus for a long season. For a long time, he'd wanted to meet Jesus. You'll have to recall with me for a moment that many years prior, near the beginning part of Jesus' ministry, there was a man by the name of John the Baptist. John the Baptist confronted Herod and said, your marriage to Herodias, your brother Philip's wife, that's an illegal relationship. You should not, told him off about how bad this thing was and what they had done wrong. And Herod imprisons John the Baptist. And then the next part of the story that happens later on is Herodias' daughter dances for Herod and the other men that are gathered there. And it pleased them enough that he said, I'll give you whatever you want. And Herodias told her daughter, tell him you want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And it grieved Herod that he had to do it, but he did it anyway. But then a little while later, Herod began getting word about this man named Jesus. And he began hearing about what Jesus was doing, and what Jesus was doing, and what Jesus was doing, and the miracles performed by Jesus. And the thought that came to Herod's mind, as is recorded for us, is, did John the Baptist rise again? And the conviction in his heart began to rise there. Now, he began to he then desired to see Jesus, but he never did. It's been multiple years since all that occurred. And now, here is Jesus. His desire has come to fruition. But at face value, Herod's gladness to see Jesus is not what it seems. Because Herod did not desire to see Jesus that he might learn from Jesus. He was not wanting to learn more about Jesus' mission and why Jesus was there on earth. He was not desiring his forgiveness of his sins. He was not desiring to put his faith in God. Instead, what do we find out about Herod? What did he want Jesus to do? A miracle. And it's interesting to note that of the times we encounter Herod Antipas, what is always going on with Herod? He's being entertained. Never serious, always entertainment. And what he really, in essence, wants Jesus to do is perform. Be a magician for me. Do a miracle. Turn this water into wine. Do this for me. Not for proof that you are God. So he questions Jesus and he tries to get Jesus to do what he wants, but he was unable, and instead Jesus what? Remains silent. When we look at Jesus in his responses to people, we find that when people come to Jesus with a sincere question, with a sincere desire, with a sincere need, Jesus answers them. Jesus will even answer trick questions. We've seen the religious leaders numerous times try to trick Jesus, and Jesus is even willing to answer them. But when it came to Pilate simply wanting Jesus to entertain him for his own pleasure, Jesus' strategy seems to take the strategy of the proverb. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like him. And seeing Jesus will not answer, the fool and his men begin to ridicule Jesus. And they strip Jesus. Oh, you say you're a king? Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, here you go. Here's a purple robe. That's what the kings wear. Aren't you a king? Hey, do this. And they begin to mock him. And they were probably egged on by the religious leaders too. James Edwards notes that this mockery and ridicule that they engaged in is perhaps the inevitable response of those whose interest in Jesus consists in their projections onto him. In other words, what can Jesus do for me? What can I get Jesus to do for me? Rather than in their response to his sovereign call. When they don't get from Jesus what they want from Jesus, they just kind of ridicule him, mock him, throw him away. He's as good as dirt to us. Such a response is even possible amongst Christians at times, isn't it? In that we think, God should do it this way. God should do this for me. God should do that for me. God should heal that person in that way, and X and Y and Z and all these things. And when it doesn't go the way we think God should have done it, sometimes we're disappointed in him. Or we are indifferent to him. Some have even gone so far as to walk away from God altogether and abandon God altogether because he just didn't do what I thought he should do or what I wanted him to do. Now, it's interesting to note that this treatment of Jesus by Herod appealed to the cruelty of Pilate. And thus it cemented their relationship. Two men that were not friends, were not together, they have so much joy at seeing Jesus mocked and ridiculed that it cements them together as friends. How would you like that to be your lasting legacy of your friendship? Well, how did you meet? How did you guys become friends? Oh, well, he mocked this man that we both knew was innocent, and we had a lot of fun, and we enjoyed a lot of pleasure about Jesus being treated inhumanely and unjustly, even though we knew he was innocent, but that brought us together. Yeah. What a record of these men. Herod sends Jesus back to Pilate. In Pilate, we see the punishment pronounced for Jesus, calls the Sanhedrin and the other religious leaders together, and he announces that following my examination of Jesus and following Herod's examination of Jesus, we came to the same conclusion. Jesus is innocent. He has done nothing deserving of death. But Pilate, again, he knows the crowd. He's a people pleaser. He knows what's going through their head. And so, he tries to pacify them. He says, I know this is not the answer that's going to satiate you. You're not going to be happy with this answer. But don't worry. I will chastise him. I will beat him and I will whip him. And I know that he's innocent. I know that and I know innocent, I know free is not the verdict that you desired me to bring. But I'll continue Herod's game. And we dressed him up like a king, and we made a whole bunch of fun of him. And now we'll just have him flogged and make it obvious to everyone. Well, he's obviously not a king. No king would never be enduring something like that. And then I'll release him. And with all that beating and everything that's going on, you don't have to worry because, after all this happened, he's not going to go around trying to lead an insurrection, and he's obviously not going to forbid taxes to Caesar. And, it's going to be pretty obvious that any inkling he has that he's a king is going to be removed. But Pilate's obvious hope that this pacifies them, and even that this might even play to their hearts, in the mention there of Luke, that the releasing of one at the Passover time, it's not a thing we know much about, but it is noted. He tries to play on their hearts, but what do? They grow more antagonistic. Verse 18, and they cried out all at once, in unison, asking for the imprisonment of Jesus and the release of Barabbas. Pilate again tries to reason with them. But now they grow louder, Luke says. And they say, crucify him. The mockery and the ridicule were fun and pleasurable, but the fun and the games have seemingly stopped all of a sudden. Because Pilate realizes the terror of this crowd. And he tries a third time to get them to think rationally. And Luke tells us they are more insistent that Jesus be crucified. And the violence of their rage causes Pilate to give in. He sentences Jesus per their request. But we note that the consciousness, or the conscience, of Pilate is aroused in this situation. Matthew tells us that when Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it. He wanted to distance himself from this. Oh, they had their fun, they had their games, and he thought everything was good and everything was going to work out fine. But he realized the crowd. And Pilate, being the Roman governor, the Jews, no one crucified people but the Romans. And to be crucified meant you must be accused or you must be condemned by the governor himself. They didn't just willy-nilly go around crucifying whomever. There was a due process, if you will, if you can call it that, to the crucifixion. And so Pilate needed to give the verdict that he could be crucified in order for Jesus to be crucified. But he wanted to distance himself. Therefore, he says, you see to it. I don't want to, I've lost all interest in this thing. And though he tried to distance himself for thousands of years, he has lived in infamy as the man that had the authority to stop this injustice. And yet he gave in to the fear of man. Tabidi Onyebiwe notes that a judiciary with people ruled by their own political interests will soon give the people what they want rather than what is right. And a public ruled by their own selfish desires will soon twist the courts to serve their desires. Justice requires nobility of character and the courage of truth-based conviction. The first part of that quote, doesn't that encapsulate what happens in Pilate's courtroom? He had the opportunity to do what was right. But because of the fear of man, he gives in to the people rather than do what is right. And the people's own selfish desires have twisted the court to do what they want, not what is right. And of course, the further irony of this whole situation is the fact that we find Barabbas is released. Barabbas had been arrested, he had been found guilty, he was imprisoned and awaiting execution. What was he in prison for? Well, aside from the murder part, he was in the sedition that is mentioned here. Insurrection. He actually tried to lead an insurrection against the Roman Empire. He would likely have been one that would have forbidden taxes to Caesar. And if he is the leader, well, who do you think would be the king if he actually was successful in the insurrection? Himself. So all the things they accused Jesus of, Barabbas was actually guilty of. And Jesus, who was accused and found not only innocent of this or without fault of this, but fully innocent, is sentenced to death, and in short order would die. Just a mere hour or two from this moment. Injustice. These thoughts lead us to consider the number 4, the unjust grace and mercy of God. The unjust grace and mercy of God. Over the past 5, 6, 10 years or so, the word justice has really risen to the forefront within our society. Word justice simply meaning this: that which is right and fair. But the word justice is capable of being abused and perverted. And the allure of calling things justice that aren't truly just is it helps to pacify and to satiate your own heart into thinking, oh, I'm doing something right. This is justice. When it's not truly justice. Many people have been convinced to believe in such justice movements, thinking this is justice, but it's not. In other words, 2 wrongs do not make a right. And if we were to ask those present in that day, involved in this mockery involving Jesus, we'd probably find a lot of them agree justice was served. Jesus got what he deserved. Many would not have, obviously. And when we look back, we look at this whole thing and we see that it is clear this is the greatest injustice that has ever occurred. A man fully innocent, condemned to die a death he did not deserve, and someone that did deserve it is released. Yet it is this great injustice where we find what? Hope. Because when we consider the salvation that comes, the salvation that is offered to us as a result of what occurred to Jesus, we realize that that salvation is no justice at all either. Salvation is not justice. It is not just. Actually, salvation is the removal of justice and the setting aside of justice. That which is fair and right for us to receive as a result of our choice to indulge in our sins, the desires of our own hearts, that which is just and fair for that, in salvation, that justice is removed and set aside. And instead, we receive what? Grace and mercy. Jesus suffered injustice so that we do not have to face justice. Because none of us want to face justice. None of us want to receive the just reward for what we have done. And because Jesus suffered this injustice so that we do not have to face true justice, we find that that is grace. That is mercy. Grace in the fact that he didn't have to. Unmerited. Unrequired. He did not have to come. Jesus was innocent. He was under no requirement to provide this way out. Yet there is mercy in that he did. Jesus the innocent fulfilled the requirements necessary to provide the way out, to provide the salvation, the freedom from the just results of our own sin. He provided it not simply for one man, but for all men. He called himself, as they accused, the Christ, the Anointed One, sent to fulfill, sent from heaven to fulfill and to complete and to make full requirement, or make all the requirements full that God had promised in the Old Testament about sending a Redeemer. And Jesus came and did that thing. He was a lamb that takes away the sin of the world, as we considered last week. And in fulfilling that promise, Jesus was, as the prophet Isaiah prophesied, oppressed and afflicted. Yet he opened not his mouth. Led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, dumb, the King James says. So he opened not his mouth. The beginning of verse 26 concludes this section. And they led Jesus away. The accused, but without fault, led away to Golgotha, where his blood would be shed, his life would be taken, and the full atonement would be paid for you and for me. Before we pray, I'd like us to conclude by singing, "And Can It Be?"